Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about the astonishing athlete, Faith Kipyegon, and her attempt to be the first woman to run a sub 4-minute mile. Spoiler alert, she didn't succeed. She's still an insanely gifted athlete. But we talk a little bit about what this ambition says about the ideology of our age. And we talk about the tensions of intrinsic biological limitations and the differences between men and women. But in particular, and very practically, we talk a little bit about how we can talk to the young women in our lives and give to them a positive vision of being a woman in a world that often gives very conflicted messages here. This will be helpful to you and also intensely practical. There are some real takeaways, which sometimes we get lost in the theoretical weeds, but this time we're really practical. As always, like, share, and subscribe. If you find value in what we do and you want to support it, you can do so by going to www.toltogether.com. Thank you so much.
Today we're going to be speaking as fathers of daughters, and this is a general conversation for those of you who are thinking about what it means to be a woman in today's culture, or men who are discipling or cheering for the women in your lives, and yeah, just some general conversation and questions about what it means to be men and women, but mostly focusing on the men encouraging women side of things. And again, as I said, particularly from a father angle here, Cameron. And the way I want to jump into this is by talking about Faith Kipyegon, Kenyan runner, absolutely phenomenal athlete. I mean, if you follow her career, oh man, she's doing stuff that is just unbelievable in the long distance running world. Kenyan, um, and almost when you say like unbelievable things in the long distance running world, the Kenyans are like, I mean, you think of cultures like Australia and rugby, or the United States and the NFL, and then you take countries that
Mhm.
put that amount of energy into their distance runners, Kenya, Ethiopia, and various others. And you know what? Surprisingly, the U.S. is doing pretty well in the middle distance racing stuff right now as well. So just a little trend to watch. Anyway, Faith Kipyegon has been in the news. It was yesterday, from the time we're recording this, when she attempted to become the first woman to run sub 4 minutes in the standard mile, which I mean is an incredible feat. So just a little bit of history on that. There were a number of guys trying that in the 1940s and 1950s. There was a lot of theory around whether or not it was even physiologically possible for a human to do this. And then in 1954, Roger Bannister in Great Britain ran 3:59, and I mean this was the shocking story of the athletic world for the ages in 1954. As soon as he did it, several other guys within a few years quickly did it in succession. And I think there are now about 2,100 guys who have run sub 4. I've seen it in person, and it is a wild thing to see somebody run 4 sub 60-second quarter miles back to back. I mean, it is a thing to like, I will clap for that when I see it.
Mhm.
Now, here's the thing 2,100 people have run sub 4. No woman has ever done it. Um, the woman's world record, I think the men's world record for, I don't want to get my numbers wrong here, but was like in like 1933, was in four and single digits, and has fallen. Faith Kipyegon, just as a in a normal race, now holds the women's world record at 4 minutes and 7 seconds, which is just nuts. By I
Astonishing.
mean, it is, you're looking at the elitist of the elite for that type of thing. Now you have Hisham El Garouj, I think maybe it's been since the 90s, ran 3:43 in the mile for the men, which is just, I mean, we're talking about
Mind-boggling.
sustained sprinting. Yeah, like a cardiovascular thing that is just phenomenal. So anyway, Faith Kipyegon 4:07, Nike, she runs for Nike, basically said, we think that in the exact right conditions, like if there is a woman who can run sub 4 in the mile, this is our bet. And so Nike engineered and conditioned and trained and set up this entire, so we're talking about like choosing the track perfectly, a very advanced aerodynamic scheme for having pacers and runners running in a formation that would block wind from her, that would not only have people in front of her but also behind her. so that the turbulence around her body, she would basically be experiencing zero air resistance. They built a specially crafted suit for her that had all these little nodules on it that was basically skin tight, but would help with the laminar flows of the air around her body. They developed a special set of shoes for her, and then of course calculated for the surface that she was running on. And so this was the big thing. You may have seen this if you follow anything running or just in global news. For June 26th was going to be the day. And what was interesting as I was talking to my daughter, who's 12, about this and enjoys kind of keeping up with what's going on in the running world, and we were talking about it in advance, and I was like, what do you think's going to happen? And my daughter's like, she's not going to do it. And and I was like, I think you're right.
Mm.
And it's not because she's not an amazing athlete, but 7 seconds off your mile PR is a 3.5% jump. Nobody's ever done something like that before. Um, it's just a phenomenal amount of time. That's an eternity in running. And long story short, we actually set aside, like, I was going to be Nike's live streaming this at 2 o'clock or whatever, and we set it aside. We sat down and watched it, and she ran a 4:06, and
Mm.
everybody was everybody's like, "Hey, she broke the world record." Obviously, a little bit of disappointment that she didn't go sub 4. The flip side is that was anybody really expecting, like, she is the best chance of making this happen, and to run a 4:06 is just nuts. But there are a couple things that flicker through my mind to bring us to the topic at hand. One is, um, the best engineering in the world isn't going to be able to overcome certain limitations in human physiology. Um, so there's that conversation to be had. The second part is, and some female sports voices were saying this in advance, of can we not just sit back and let our minds be blown at a 4:07 versus saying, well, 2,000 guys have run sub 4. This one, there should be a woman to do it. And so that's the and not and to be clear, not everybody was in that camp, and that really wasn't. I mean, 4 minutes is just kind of a nice, neat, even number, and so there's a standard there to crave for somebody to be the first woman to do that, for sure. But there is a little bit of comparative element here of, like, over 2,000 guys have done it. Surely a woman. And I wonder, Cameron, if we could have a conversation around this. When can we, or what is the foundation that we as Christians can have for distinguishing between the glorious differences of human bodies, and saying a woman who can run a 4:07, which I know no men right now in my life that can run. Like, yeah, I mean, where are we
Right. Yeah.
demeaning the incredibleness of that feature by attempting to compare it across genders in the sports world? And then maybe we can spool that off into some other conversation of, like, how do we really encourage and value and see the goodness and encourage, like, splendid physiological female human performance, while at the same time not making it comparative to men who are just categorically physiologically different in a lot of these events.
Well, if I may possibly ask a leading question here, in your estimation, Nathan, since you follow the sport quite closely, wha- was this what was were the motivations behind this? You've just described some very carefully, scientifically calibrated efforts to ensure that this happened. But in your estimation, was the thinking behind this scientific or more ideological in nature?
I think it was
'Cause I
ideological. So I think it's ideological with science will help us solve this problem.
Okay, that's 'cause I was gonna say, do presumably the minds behind this are very, these are very intelligent people who are trying to oversee this whole project, shall we call it that?
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time believing that any of them were drawing different conclusions from your daughter.
That's what I couldn't quite, like, that's what I couldn't quite wrap my head around, because everything was so, like, this is going to happen. And I think people who are like, I mean, you talk about the years and the thousands of miles that people run to shave a second or two off of an event like this.
Mhm.
Like, either they knew something else that they were expecting was gonna happen, or it was a little more wishful thinking, or it was just like, "Hey, if ever there is an opportunity, this is the lady who's gonna do it." Um, they did this with Eliud Kipchoge. Remember when he ran a sub 2-hour marathon in ideal conditions, and they set it all up with a pace car and all that just to show that it wouldn't count as a world record, just to show that it was physiologically possible. And so there are times I think in which science can help us push a boundary a little bit to say, okay, it's categorically possible to shoot for this. Um,
Yes.
because psychologically it does matter. That's what happened with Roger Bannister when he did it. Then suddenly other people were able to do it. So there was a little bit of a psychological
Yeah,
barrier here. So I think optimism and science can push us past some of those what are psychological barriers to make us strive for it. I'm trying to play.
but
I'm
that's
trying
well
to give
said. Yep.
a strong man for it here.
Devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Yes, because well, so I think what you're saying is true, but it's in a bit of a different category here because right here, it's not so much the question of is this humanly possible? We have to narrow it down. This is humanly possible? Is it possible for a woman to pull this off? Which is what makes this one. It has. I mean, obviously, it can't not have some political overtones. I mean, let me risk at the risk of just taking us immediately into some deeper waters here. You will perhaps remember a friend of ours who was on a mission, a student mission. You weren't on this mission, but I think you heard about this. This is a friend of ours named Ivy. Hi, Ivy. Dr. Ivy now. But she was on this mission with us. We were at the kind of in the student center. This was University of California, Berkeley, and there were some demonstrations happening from students. One of them was from a feminist group. She went to this table and began to ask, I think she asked at least 3 people, it might have been more, "What is feminism?" And couldn't
Mhm.
get a straight answer from any of them. Now, the only reason I bring that up right here is because I think it's worth I think for some people, an answer, a kind of answer that you might get is well, at least initially, it would have been that, well, men and women are equal. And then if you press into
Right. Yeah.
the specifics of that. So what do you mean by equal? So it's one thing to say men and women are equal in value. You and I would completely co-sign, absolutely, equal in value. But it's another thing entirely to say men and women are basically indistinguishable. Gender is kind of more of a construct, and there are social conventions that come along with femininity and masculinity, but all of those can be taken apart very easily, and we can dismantle them, and we can see that stripped away, human beings are fundamentally the same. So therefore, men and women are equal, and in that sense,
Yeah.
we would push back. But it would seem that biology also pushes back a little bit, and which is where we find
So
ourselves here.
so I'll be interested to see, like, so how old are your kids, Cameron, for the people listening here?
5 so my daughter yeah, sure, my daughter is 5, my son's 8.
Okay. I
So a
would
little
bet,
younger
I
than
don't know
your
if you've
daughter.
tried this, yeah, so but I would bet that your son can pretty easily do a chin up and your daughter can't. Um,
Yes.
Even at this
How
age.
dare you?
Well, I'm just
Just kidding.
because
Yep,
this is where this comes in of, like, where I think we have to be comparative to have a healthy conversation. So, my daughter's 12,
yep,
and even, like, last year, she would point out to me, she would say, "Dad, we play flag football at recess, boys against girls," and she said, we can stick with them running, and maneuver, like, everything's fine on the line and on short distance stuff." She's like, "We
yep,
just don't have any girls who can throw the ball deep." So what's she recognizing there? That at 11, 12 years old, already men can throw a football. This is just playground averages that a
yep,
12-year-old boy can throw a football farther than a 12-year-old girl. Um, Her brothers can do more chin-ups than she can. And it's not like she's not fit. It's just that her body is made differently. And
yep,
my wife and I talk about this, and it's something that when my wife runs, and that, like, there's a lot to celebrate there, but it is different. And so what my daughter was saying, watching Faith Kipyegon, so to be fair, she ran the first 3 laps on pace like, it was fun to watch this race. There was a lot to cheer for.
yeah,
And then in the last quarter mile, she ran a 65. Okay. most people listening to this can't run a 65 quarter mile if a tiger was chasing them. You know,
I never
do it.
will in my life. That is
Yeah,
freakishly fast. Yeah.
right, and do it at the end. But here's
Yeah.
what my daughter pointed out is you had 8 guys who run for Nike who were running beside her, and in the last 200 meters specifically, Grant Fisher, American runner, young guy, just a pleasure of a human to watch. Like he's just a joyful person. You should look him up sometime. Medaled in the last Olympics, and is great. But Grant Fisher is running beside her, and you can tell that he notices that she's dropping off pace, and he starts. So my daughter points out that she's like, you can see him talking to her and motioning with his hand.
Mm.
Um, and so what she said is like, yes, Faith Kipyegon just ran the fastest a woman has ever run this. However, at the same time, one of the 8 guys was talking to her and motioning with his hands while doing that. You know, like in the fit, like nobody was like,
Yeah.
look at those dudes who ran a 406. Like they did it conversational. Um, and so like help me in this of so one of the things that I love,
Yeah.
our friend Alicia was visiting, and I think this is if you're listening to this and you're a dude, um, look for friends like this for the women around you. And if you're a lady, think about how you can do this move that Alicia did. So I have a daughter growing up with all brothers, and Alicia said to Madeline, "Oh, Madeline, I love being a woman so much. Like being a girl is so fun, and I'm so delighted that God made me this way. It's just a real privilege in life to get to be a woman." That's just
Mm.
it took 10 minutes, just a very simple, but I think it helps us start to push back against this, like a woman is a lesser form of a female is a lesser form of a male because we're different
Mm.
physiologically. And it's weird, but all of the feminist vibe that we're coming from somehow has not cracked that code of still seemingly giving that sort of underlying impulse. Or maybe I'm totally misreading this, Cameron, but it does seem to me to feel like some of modern feminism is basically saying, yeah, that back to false equivalency in categorical distinctions. Help me here with that, because I think there's a way in which we as
Oh,
Christians can really speak to this beautifully and look for some practical things that we can say to be very encouraging and to
yeah.
push back against some cultural ridiculousness.
Well, I'm out of my depth here a little bit, and I'll try to lend some support. I think, feminism, of course, doesn't arise in a vacuum. Any ism doesn't arise in a vacuum. And feminism comes about against a backdrop of historical mistreatment and injustice against women. That's undeniable. And so it's interesting to look. I mean, there are waves of feminism. If you've ever studied the literature, if you've done a graduate seminar, you've heard, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave
Mhm.
feminism. And it's the later installments that tend to get a little bit more heavy on theory and sound a little stranger to people. But in it's when it initially emerges on the scene, these are women who are committed to just fighting for the rights of women. Of course, the rights of women to vote, to have more personal autonomy, and to be treated, frankly, like adults. So there's
Mhm.
so there is that. So that's not predicated on the assumption that women have to be exactly like men. That happens later. That's predicated on the assumption that women and men should share equal rights. But eventually, you do see how there's a kind of snowball effect. So let's just mention that for a second because of that historical backdrop of injustice. That's important. That's also why it's important that Alicia would say these words to your daughter because traces of that, or more than traces of that, are still around to I also happen to be a brother of a very brilliant and very independent and strong-minded sister who does mixed martial arts, is fiercely independent in her thinking, and would describe herself as a feminist. So I've had the benefit of living with her. She's one of my best friends as well, but also hearing from her the way many of the things that we just seem to say come across and just the casual utterances that many women have to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. convey to them the idea that they are somehow less than, or that their perspective isn't as important, or that they need some, man to come along and validate and explain things to them. These may be some utterances that are surprising to hear from me, but I do think I just wanna note that before we say anything else about,
Well, sure.
where we're at today.
Let's give that, and let's also just throw in the massive amount of scientific ignorance that was part of this as well. I mean, that's why women weren't allowed to run the marathon.
Yes.
Like we don't know if a woman can survive that. To go farther, I've mentioned this before. When my grandpa thinks this is the funniest thing ever. When he had an older sister who was in college in probably the early 50s, and at that time, college women's basketball, each team had 6 players. You had 3 women on offense and 3 women on defense. The women didn't run full court because it wasn't really thought that the women's stamina, so you had,
Yeah.
your offensive team would receive the ball from your defensive team and you didn't cross half court. Because they just weren't sure if the female, physiology, or if this would mess up their future reproductive ability or what. I don't, but it was just
That's wild. Yeah.
that's
It
wild. Like women can't run full court
yeah,
in basketball. Like I know somebody
yeah.
who's in living memory that was the academic literature thought that that was how.
Mhm.
So when we bring the science into it later, we can be like thumbs up. Thank you, scientific progress, for helping us recognize what we already knew is true. I think, but the but yeah, that's a huge part, and I appreciate the way you traced kind of the waves through that. And yeah, I mean, I know your wife probably would be somebody good to talk to on this too, who works in the fitness industry. So you can,
Oh, for certain, yeah.
so you get the same point. Say you have a very strong, independent mixed martial arts sister who loves training and will never bench press as much as you, and that has nothing to do with any statement of value. But I think what we are pushing back against here, Cameron, is that there's a way in which science liberates us from ignorance, but science does have a tendency to reduce us all into the same thing. And this is where a
Yeah.
reductionism is not helpful.
Well, so if we go to those later waves, they become entangled in critical theory and postmodern thinking. And so they begin to take apart they do what these theories do, they deconstruct. And so they look at, and it's pretty easy to do this in terms of gender stereotypes, those do exist. You can take those gender stereotypes, when, girls like pink and they like to play with Barbie dolls. Well, not all girls do, some girls are tomboys, and so does that mean that does that somehow pose a threat to femininity as
Yeah,
such,
but
or does it
even
show
the
that we've
phrase
got
tomboy, though, plays into this conversation
or
where we're
does?
saying this is a girl who's acting like a boy, not just this is what girls are like.
Right, and then, of course, what do you mean acting like a boy? Why? Has it, so boys play cowboys and Indians, and so, well, cowboys and Native Americans now. Well, once you start doing that, though, the hard sciences sit in real tension with any kind of critical theory, and this is why in certain sectors of critical theory, science is actually singled out as being highly prejudiced. This is not always the case, by the way, but in certain sectors it is. It's singled out as being, you know, it it it's dismissed as something that is inherently Western and limiting and has a huge history of discrimination and so on and so forth. I don't wanna go into all of that, but what I wanna do is talk about that interesting tension. So this is where you even find somebody like a Richard Dawkins basically pushing back against some of the new academic ideology because it flies in the face of just basic biological truths, laws. So if you come
Mm.
to a so it's one thing, in other words, Nathan, to say, well, gender is a social construct. And you can make some very sophisticated arguments for that. You can write books on it. Books have been written. Forests of trees have given their lives to this subject. But it's another thing when you just look at intrinsic biological limitations. It's not so easy to sidestep those. In fact, you can't sidestep those. And
Mhm.
that then becomes, but it doesn't, that's why if you look at an instance like the one you just brought up here, that's why the big brains working for Nike who are trying to scientifically engineer the perfect environment for this amazing athlete, to be on equal footing with men. That's why this looks more ideologically motivated than scientifically motivated, because the matter is kind of settled on that score. And it's not a problem unless you are committed, whether wittingly or unwittingly, to the notion that equality means that men and women have to be the same in every
Yeah.
fundamental way.
So I wonder if we're getting ourselves in a little bit of a knot here, Cameron, because I mean, it's been the last 5 years that it's been a bigger conversation about uh, trans athletes and men and women's sports and back and forth and all of that because I think if you talk to the average Nike engineer who was working on this project, they would say, "No, we're not trying to make Faith Kipyegon like run like a man because that's a physiologically categorical difference. We're just trying to go for a number here that's, kind of this
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
more
That's
people have climbed Mount Everest than have run sub 4 in the mile. Like, think about it in those terms. However,
wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
yeah, however, they are if you go that route, you're subtly saying there is a deep physiological difference between men and women. However, sociologically and culturally, that's been the fight for the last 5 years in sports is like there isn't a difference. And so these these things are
But Nathan, Nathan,
I think as a 38-year-old guy looking at this, Cameron, we can be like, "Oh yeah, these are fads, they're in and out, they flow by." It's a different thing to think about being a teenage girl right now playing soccer. So
oh,
this is where I
sure.
think
But
it takes some time for us to be mindful about how we talk about these things um in passing.
I think so. Yes. And I mean, those are two very important and distinct issues. I think finding ways, it's so important to find ways, creative ways, and simple ways sometimes, but simple and profound ways to just give a positive vision of the created order. Now, I'm just speaking as a Christian here, and this extends
Mhm.
to a lot of those sensitive topics. So, for instance, I mean, I know so many people who grew up, this is semi-related, but who grew up and for them sex itself was a shameful thing that ought not to be talked about, and it was only spoken of in tones of whispered disapproval or hissing condemnation. And so finding ways to show that no, this itself, sex, for instance, is a good thing. It has a telos and a purpose. Masculinity is a good thing. It has a telos and a purpose. Femininity is a good thing. It has a telos and a purpose. The Lord made you to be who you are, specifically for a reason, and it's a good thing. And of course, another way of doing this, Nathan, and this is truly thinking out loud. Here it is, but we don't often talk about the inherent limitations of masculinity as well, because that also is a real thing. I mean, men may
Mhm.
have. We're talking about feats of, shall we call them feats of brute strength? That might not be technically the accurate way of saying it, but there are certainly many domains and areas where women are the superiors of men and exceed men, and those exist, and there are so in other words, we are all built with certain intrinsic limitations, all of
Yeah.
us. And that's not, so it's not just women. I think it's worth bringing that up too,
Well, here's
for what
let
it's
me
worth.
let's go a little bit farther on that, is that the biblical ideal is masculinity and femininity in harmony, not in isolation. And so they really don't
Right.
make sense without each other. I think it's in who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel? Jared Diamond. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. I used
Um,
to have that.
yeah,
It went back to a used bookstore. I'm sorry,
right back.
Diamond.
Yeah,
Dr. Diamond, Professor
yeah.
Diamond.
It wasn't a double read. I mean, it's interesting. Probably people should know
It could be. It wasn't for me. Yeah.
the basic. But I think it's in that book that he points out that there has never been an example in human history where a woman can gather enough calories for her and a child by herself. Just think about that for a second. That a human female, there's never been a culture and time in which a nomadic or agricultural that a human woman can gather enough calories to sustain both themselves and a child. That's just a wild scientific statement. But what
Sure.
does that mean? That there's an inherent dependency there of, so you can say, oh, it's a culture where the woman has the baby and the man goes out and hunts. Yeah, just because that's mathematically how the calories work there, that the energy that it takes to grow a human inside you and then nourish it for the first 2 years of its life. I mean, that's a phenomenal caloric. You know how it is. You're a dad, but I'm
Undertaking.
just
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
undertaking. So
Yep.
so one of the things that I think is not. And now we live at a time where you can cruise through a drive-through and order a number 2, and it takes no calories. So, I mean, modern technology does shift the way in which we think about these things to a good bit. But I think the combination of thinking about encouraging the men around us, and celebrating the way that God made them, and then encouraging the women around us and celebrating the way that God made them, is to not silo these categories into, um, yeah, like a partisan divide, which
Yeah.
seemingly can kind of happen in some of these conversations, but to really bring a vision of richness and fullness and a complementary way in which we think about the way in which we're not fully human without each other. And you're like, oh, that sounds interesting. Where do we get?
That's
Oh,
good.
all the way back to Genesis. Like, like this
Yeah.
idea that we aren't like he made them in his image, male and female, he made them.
Yeah.
And so I think looking for these opportunities to have good conversations with the young men and young women around us. So I think this is a thinking out loud episode that has a very specific. We want you to do this. Like, here's the to do as a result of listening to this.
Action
And
item.
to find it,
Action item
action
here.
item.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
find a young person, and in this case, if you have them in your life, specifically a young woman, and if you're a woman in particular, speak to the virtues and the joy that you have of being a woman. And if you're a man, find somebody in your life, young woman or so, that you can speak words of real encouragement into and say, "Isn't it neat that God made you this way? And I hope that you can grow and delight in the body that God has given you, and just affirm the physical goodness of creation, in the ways in which God's made it known in people's lives,
Mm.
and do that as an act of rebellion against cultural tendencies to unfairly compare and then subconsciously demean the splendor of the diversity that God has given us in the created world." And so, um, that's something that I want to do today and have been doing over the last day, and discussing these things in a very fun, um, serious and flippant and uh, deep and laughing kind of way with my daughter. And I trust that you guys can find ways to have these conversations in your lives as well. So, thanks for helping me think through that out loud a little more, Cameron.
And thanks for listening in. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.